Hi there and welcome to the My Learning channel. In the previous movie, I showed you how to override attributes to hide objects on layers while keeping their reflections and refractions, or matting them out of the foreground. In this video, I'll show you some more handy things that overrides can do. Before I begin, notice that I have 4 different layers, each with their own subcollections that look quite similar. Opening even a couple of these can make things quite confusing. So to make it clear exactly which layer I'm working on, I'm going to click this button up here to hide anything not currently active. Now I can't accidentally modify anything but the layer I'm currently looking at. Next, I'll open the global render settings. Notice that they refer specifically to my active layer up here. That means I can override them too. Doing so creates a special collection called Render Settings that stays at the top of my layer. And like our other overrides, I can set the override values in both the Render Settings or Property Editor. Since these values correspond to my low-resolution render, let's identify them as such. First, I'll right-click the Render Settings and create a subcollection called Low. Then I'll select all my overrides and middle drag them inside. But now suppose I want some medium settings too. Well then I'll just copy and paste my low settings, rename them mid, and then alter the values appropriately. However, this presents an interesting problem. Since I've overridden the same attributes twice, which setting will Maya use when it renders the scene? The answer to that is actually one of the most important rules of render setup. Overrides lower on the list always take priority over those above them. So as long as both low and mid settings are active, the renderer will always render on medium settings. However, if I disable the medium settings, then re-render, Maya will switch to low settings. If you think about it, this is also consistent with the global render settings too, which exist all the way up here. If I disable both low and mid settings, then Maya will go back to using the global settings for everything. And of course, this only applies for attributes that I've overridden. For anything that doesn't have an override, such as, say, volume indirect, Arnold will use the global render settings regardless, since it doesn't exist anywhere else. Now I can use the same process to create some high settings. Now that I've got high, medium, and low settings all set up, I'll unhide the rest of my layers and copy and paste this entire render settings collection to them as well. Think of these as more versatile presets that will allow me to set quality on a per layer basis. Later on, when we're ready to do our final renders, this setup will also allow me to tweak individual settings per layer, depending on what they contain. So for example, increasing specular samples for layers with very shiny objects, or subsurface scattering samples for those with translucent ones. However, I'm not quite ready for that level of optimization yet. One thing I do need to start thinking about though is optimizing batch renders versus single frame renders. Typically in production, batch renders will be sent to a render farm, which can crunch my entire timeline in the background, without impacting my working machine. Additionally, sometimes there's certain effects that I like to see in motion, like motion blur, that lose their context in a still frame. Also, because single frame renders are done locally on my machine, and because I use them much more often for testing, I want to speed them up as much as possible, aka getting the fastest first pixel. In other words, I want the fastest local render possible without affecting the quality of my batch render, which will get farmed out anyway. To do that, I'll use something called a local override. So going back to my vehicle layer, I'm going to return to the render settings. Notice that I already overrode the motion blur toggle, which added an override here in my layer's render settings. Now watch what happens if I right-click and select Toggle Local Override. A dot appears next to it, signifying that it's now a local override. Now I'll turn Motion Blur on in the master layer, which doesn't affect the prop's vehicle layer. Then I'll render the scene. So, as expected, there's no sign of motion blur here. However, if I batch render the animation, then the motion blur is in. For another example of how this level of customization can come in handy, let me switch to my set layer. Then select the street. Here in my Arnold section, you can see the subdivisions are set to Cat Clark. This means that at render time, Arnold is subdividing the street geometry 3 times to better capture the detail of small displacement such as bumps or grooves. To give you a better idea of what I mean, I'll temporarily switch the render view to wireframe shading mode. See how detailed the street is compared to the original? As nice as that is, this process is costly and slow, so I'd prefer to avoid it during test renders. So I'll override it and then toggle on its local override. Then I'll set the subdiv type to none. Now if I render a single frame, you'll see it renders faster since the street is less detailed. But again, in a batch render, everything will appear at full quality. Actually, if I look at the debug render again, it looks like there's still some smoothing going on. This is because Maya might be doing some subdividing on top of what Arnold is doing too. So I'll just local override these as well. Actually, if I want to be really thorough, I need to override the adaptive tessellation too. Depending on where and who these assets came from, they may have chosen to subdivide it in one of these 3 ways. By overriding all 3 methods, we cover all our bases. And for any object that doesn't use one of these methods, the override just gets ignored. Now I'll make them local overrides. And then minimize all their values. And now if I re-render, you'll see the wireframe is 1-to-1 with my original. And now for the actual render. Now I can evaluate lighting adjustments very quickly before sending them off to the farm at higher quality. Not only that, but regular overrides can even coexist with local overrides too. This means that I can render a single frame with one value, and the layer's batch render with another. And if I don't want the setting to apply to all the shape nodes in my collection, well then I can just change this asterisk in the parent collection to the street's shape node specifically. Hopefully by now you're starting to see just how powerful overrides can be when evaluating a scene for lighting and rendering. But what if evaluating isn't my job? What if it's just my job to optimize the scene while it's somebody else's to light it? How can I get them all these customizations I've made? In the next movie, I'll show you how to save your layers as a template, which you can then pass along to different departments working on the same scene.